Chaos ensues at George Washington University, anti-Israeli protests, where the GW president, Ellen Granberg, had no choice but to ask for help from D.C. authorities after some of the participants in these protests reportedly began calling for beheadings. Chants for the guillotine were targeted toward the GW president, GW's African-American provost, Christopher Allen Bracey, and other school administrators. Because of the agitators infiltrating these protests, threatening beheadings, it's all but prevented discourse and debate over concerns about the way Israel is conducting its war against Hamas and the reported mounting non-combatant casualties in the Gaza territory. Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida and member of the House Oversight Committee joins me now to discuss this. It's good to see you, sir. Now, you went down to these protests at GWU, where one of the protesters, you tell us, began shouting at you, calling you a race traitor and Uncle Tom. Couple this with protesters spray painting Free Palestine on the steps of a building in Canada and spelling Palestine wrong. It appears that these protests are firmly in the control of the anti-Semite, racist, and ignorant left-wingers. What's your take on this?
Chris, good to be with you. I would say your take is absolutely correct because, you know, these protesters, and let me add, some of these protesters are not college students. These are paid agitators. These protesters, these agitators in these encampments, their design is to unwind America as we know it, frankly, and to split us from our ally in Israel. It's very disgusting what's happening in these protests. And I think it's important that the American people know firsthand that this is a minority-held view of how we are looking across the world, especially with our ally Israel. To the professor in question, to the protester who called me a race traitor, he's a professor at American University, at Georgetown, and at GW. And so we need to take a long, hard look at some of these faculty and some of these staffers who are teaching some of our young people, because their radicalism and their ideology, unfortunately, is being fomented on college campuses across America.
Yeah, and I, as a liberty-loving Latino, I don't want my tax dollars funding a professor like that, padding the pockets of a professor like that. I don't like racism, and I don't think we should be funding it with government taxpayer money. After years of Joe Biden claiming that no one but the rich benefited from President Trump's tax cuts, and he himself promising not to raise taxes, here's Karine Jean-Pierre confirming that Joe Biden will allow the Trump tax cuts to expire, thus raising taxes on virtually everybody in the United States. Watch.
The president says that he wants to let the tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, expire. If that law expires, it does raise taxes on almost every American. So does he still support that expiring without anything else in place?
So look, as you said, the president is going to is going to let the Trump tax cut expire, and he was very clear. But he will not raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year.
Okay, sure. Congressman, the New York Times lamented, face it, quote, face it, you got a tax cut because of the Trump tax cuts, describing how the vast majority of Americans received a cut. The New York Post concluded that the rich, not the poor and the middle class, were actually soaked by the Trump tax cuts. And the Hill shouted, IRS data proves Trump tax cuts benefited middle, working class Americans the most. Isn't it telling that Joe Biden and his Democrat Party want to reverse all that?
They honestly just want to get rid of it because Donald Trump is the one that put it together. We currently are living under the best tax policy in the history of the United States. The federal government's raising more revenue than it ever has at any other point in the history of our country. People are able to keep more of their money. So what is the problem? Secondarily, why is Joe Biden talking to me about taxes? His own son is a tax evader. And I didn't see him making sure his son paid his taxes, but now he wants to get his hands into everybody else's pockets. This is what happens when you have these limousine liberals. They want to be able to get everybody else's money while they find ways to cut corners and cut the system for their own benefit. The Trump tax cuts need to be extended. Quite frankly, they need to become permanent. And what the Democrat Party needs to really understand is that good tax policy is good for all Americans and it is good for our economy. You cannot use class warfare when you have a tax policy that's been to the benefit of poor Americans, middle-income Americans, yes, and rich Americans in our country.